Orcs Don't Babysit, Part 2, by Tony Edwell, aka Dragons After Dark. When they got home, Crawled had Fixa stay with the wagon while he checked if the ogre had blundered through, or worse, was lurking around. Everything was untouched as far as he could tell, and as soon as he gave her the all-clear, Fixa carefully clambered down, cradling the egg. "Can you unload the parts and make a pile outside the workshop? I need to get started on the heating lamp," she said, not once looking up from the egg. "Sure," he relented. "Thanks." With that, she hurried to the workshop, not even bothering to shut down the robot. Crawled examined the remote. He determined it had far too many buttons to risk pressing any, and left it on the wagon seat. One explosion a month was more than enough. Once he piled all the parts outside the workshop and put the wagon away, after carefully extricating it from around the whirring robot, Crawled headed to the workshop to check on Fixa. She wasn't there. Crawled froze, his heart giving a painful squeeze before thundering against his ribs. Had he missed something on his check and the ogre got her? It wasn't likely, since ogres were not stealthy. However, that logic did nothing to ease the churning in his gut. "Fixa," he called out, doing his best to keep the worry from his voice. "In here." Her voice was muffled, coming from the back of her little house where she'd built the kitchen. Crawled blew out a relieved breath and headed that way. Fixa's kitchen was tidy, but hadn't seen much use before Crawled had shown up. Until then, she'd survived on field rations and whatever else he'd sent her. When he'd asked why she'd bothered to build one if she wasn't going to use it, she'd shrugged and said she'd never seen a house without one and it seemed strange not to. She'd bolted the base of a softly glowing lamp into the wall, and it was pointed down at the rough wooden table where they took their meals. The egg was nestled in a small crate lined with clean rags from her workshop. "It's already warm here, so I didn't want to make the lamp too powerful, just enough to keep the temperature even. I have a thermometer here." Fixa pointed to a little gauge hanging off the side of the crate. "And the lamp's heat will adjust to keep it just about our body temperature," she finished, stifling a yawn. "Sounds like you did good work, and quick too. Now it's time to stop procrastinating and take that nap," Crawled said. "But I can't just leave it here. What if the ogre comes back to get it? What am I, chopped boar liver? I can watch the egg and take care of the ogre if it shows up." She narrowed her eyes and pursed her lips. Crawled sighed. "I won't eat it. Promise? On my ancestors. Hope to die," he said, putting his right hand over his heart while reciting the promise they'd make to each other when they were kids. Fixa's shoulders slumped and she yawned again, the final wisp of energy that had sustained her dissipating quicker than stew in a war camp. "Wake me up before dinner?" she asked as she headed to the stairs that led up to her room over the kitchen. "Of course. Thank you." She clomped up the steps, shuffled around for a minute in her room above Crawled's head, until there was finally a whimp of her falling into bed. Crawled looked from the ceiling down to the egg and gave it the incredulous look it deserved. Leaning over, he gently placed his ear against the shell. There was no sound, and he blamed the fact that he was trying so hard to hear something that his ear tingled where it touched the shell. He turned to face it again, remaining eye level with the egg. "Looks like it's just you and me." He paused, quickly standing up as he shook his head. "And now I'm talking to the egg." Turning his back on what he figured would be a future breakfast item, he pulled out food to start dinner prep. It was hours yet, but he'd promised to watch the egg, so that meant he could work ahead for the next few meals. Plus, they had strawberries, so maybe he'd make a dessert. He hummed and sang softly as he worked. He'd gotten a few snide comments while he was a soldier for the Horde for enjoying cooking, at least until he'd threatened to stop. He'd decided on a stew for dinner to use up the leftover vegetables from this past week's meals, and the rest of the bear jerky from his last hunt. For the strawberries, he'd make jam from most of them, then a sauce with strawberry chunks to go over the sugar cookies he'd made last week that were getting stale. With his plan set, he went to work, the thunk of the knife hitting the cutting board creating a hypnotic rhythm. Which is why it took him a moment to hear the tapping. Tap, 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 tap. He stopped and stood perfectly still. Nothing. He frowned and went back to work. Tap, 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 crack. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. Every muscle was frozen as he turned around, stiff as a statue, the strawberries in his hand forgotten. He locked gazes with a pair of big violet eyes, peeking out from over the top of the crate. They belonged to a green lizard, with a beige underbelly and pink fins on the back of its head moving down its back. It made a strange, high-pitched, chirping squeal, and tilted its head as it considered him, the feathery antennae on its head perking up as it leaned toward him. This caused the crate to wobble and tip, and the creature let out a distressed croak as it jerked back. Crawled took a sharp intake of breath and a half-step toward it. "Easy," he said in what he hoped was a low, soothing tone. However, his voice had the opposite effect, and its eyes brightened as it spread a pair of still wet wings and chirped again. They were the color of a sunset on the bottom, with yellow-orange spots, and as it moved upward it turned into the night sky, with matching yellow spots like crescent moons. The wings were finally the giveaway he needed. "Sprite darter," he whispered. Before he could think about it much more, the darter let out another excited chirp and pushed forward on the box. Unfortunately, its wings were still too wet, and they flapped uselessly as it tumbled forward over the edge of the small table. The kitchen was just big enough that he had to lunge forward to catch it, while also trying to make sure he didn't crush its wings. However, when he'd reached for it, he'd dropped the strawberries, which ended up beneath his foot. At this point, all of Crawled's warrior's grace left him. He slipped, managing to slam more body parts than he thought possible into everything within touching distance, and crashed to the floor. And that was how Fixa found him, sprawled on the floor, cradling a very concerned sprite darter hatchling as it chirped in concern and licked the side of his face. "Oh my gears, are you okay? What is?" she gasped. "Gadgets. Is that a sprite darter?" "No, and yes," he grumbled face first on the floor, refusing to get up. "Let me help you," she said. It wasn't until the darter let out a panicked croak and burrowed under his chin that he realized she was talking to the creature. I think it might have bonded with you," she said. "Wonderful. How do we unbond it?" he asked, as he shifted to sit up. The darter scrabbled to remain attached to him and curled its whip-thin, delicate tail around his throat. It wasn't choking him, and it was trembling slightly with its wings and antennae flattened against itself. He sighed and shifted it gently to rest over top one of his shoulders like a baby. "I don't think you can, but on the bright side you two look adorable," she reassured him. "That's not my biggest concern at the moment." "Right? Of course not. We should be more worried about why the ogre had the egg." He imagined it was for the same reason he'd suggested earlier, eating. "That's not, oh," she said, smacking the palm of her hand with a fist. "You're right, we need to name it." Her eyes were sparkling as she looked between the darter and him. "What should we call it?" Without missing a beat, he said, "Scrambled eggs." Her mouth dropped open a little, and she tried to give him a stern look, but it failed as she broke out laughing. "Eggs it is then."